And welcome to the JJ Dillon podcast. I am your co-host, JP John Paz, and with me, as always, is the star of the show, two-time Hall of Famer, the leader of the legendary Four Horsemen, the second greatest manager of all time, former WWF and WCW executive, James J. Dillon. JJ, how are you doing this evening?
Oh, great.
Figured since we talk about so many different names and different guys in the show, I figured someone do a little bit different, maybe do a word association. So I'll just name someone at random, and you just think of a phrase or a story, something, not something overly crazy or long, but kind of like the first thing that pops in your head, maybe the first thought or phrase, or maybe a first quick story. I'll just name somebody at random, and you just give your first thought. What do you think?
I will take a shot at it.
The first guy, just to throw out there, Lex Luger.
Lex Luger is someone who very gifted athletically in terms of his physique. I came to work with Lex while I was with the Hall of Fame, and he got crosswise with Bruiser Brody. Probably that's his biggest claim to fame. He was in a cage match somewhere in Florida, and Bruiser Brody was one of the outstanding talents that ever associated with the pro wrestling world, but he was also somebody who was, I'm trying to pick the right words. He was somebody who didn't have a lot of patience. He just liked to deal with people that had the same commitment that he did to whatever he was doing, and got involved with Lex, and they were in a cage match. It didn't go well, and took exception to Lex, and all of a sudden, I can imagine with Frank Goodish, Bruiser Brody being inside of a steel cage, and then have him lose patience with me, not satisfied with my performance or my commitment, and all of a sudden let his frustrations be known to the point that Lex Luger finally climbed up to a top turnbuckle, clawed his way over the top, and clawed his way down to the floor, made a beeline for the dressing room, grabbed his clothes out the door, and that was the end of that relationship.
And then went right straight to the Four Horsemen. So the first thing that comes to your mind when you think of Four Horsemen?
I think of it as being a unique collection of individuals, all of whom were already at the top of their game, and who individually also got along with everybody else that was mentioned in the group, and we kind of were already spending a lot of time, by choice with each other. We were all active in the business at the time, and just had tremendous success and kind of fed off of each other, and ended up creating a situation that we were a group that our success was kind of something that the fans created and ran with, and just thrilled that I'm sure as I look back with my legacy in the world of professional wrestling, one of my proudest moments, proudest accomplishments was that I was part of it, and considered that I still use that description when I talk about where I'm going to appear or wherever my name is used. I always, James J. Dillon, the leader of the original Four Horsemen.
Absolutely. What about the NWO?
I'm sorry, the NWO. NWO. The NWO was a group of guys who, I want to say, I'm not going to say that they copied what the Four Horsemen were, but it was a similar situation. But the Horsemen were something that would be often imitated and would never be duplicated, because you're talking about history that goes back, well over 25 years, and the NWO was was something that had some degree of success too, but and I can say this, I'm with pride that they did well as a group and had recognition, but there's only one Four Horsemen, always imitated but never duplicated.
What about the first thing that comes to mind when you think of Eric Bischoff?
I always have had an attitude with the business that if I don't have something good to say about something, I kind of prefer not to say anything at all. So I don't really have much to say about Eric Bischoff. He started up in Minneapolis working for Vern Gagne, and and I don't mean this to be demeaning, but they said that he was somebody that went and got the coffee for everybody and really didn't have a meaningful role up there. And then when he got down to Atlanta and found himself the right place, the right time, and the Turner organization was looking for somebody to run the wrestling division, and somebody pointed out that Bischoff had been a television guy who also had some knowledge of wrestling. So that immediately endeared the people in the Turner organization that had this hot commodity of their wrestling division, but really didn't understand it. And there were some people in the Turner organization that really looked down on wrestling as being beneath them, and were kind of embarrassed by the success that they had. So somehow Bischoff fit nicely into the organization, and he's somebody who I have not worked with that much. But he's someone who was Eric was very good. He'd be a super salesman. If I had a used car lot or a new car dealership and wanted to hire a super salesman, Eric Bischoff would be the first guy that I'd want to hire. If that kind of tells you, where I see his greatest talents.
What about Vince Russo?
Vince is. He was a guy that worked with one of he actually was a writer for a magazine and in charge of the magazine. And then when Turner, wanted to build this division, one of the names mentioned, they were looking for people that had experience, and his name was mentioned. And he came in and had a meeting with the head of the wrestling division under Turner, and made a good impression, and just somebody who has done very well for himself, but just I never really developed a strong personal relationship with.
Vince McMahon. What's kind of the first thing you think of when you think of Vince? I know an old friend, but what do you like? What's the first thing that popped in your head?
Beginning, you said, could you try to think of one word? And so with him, it's easy. I would say genius. When I started being around the business, I was in college and had wrestled in college as an amateur, and was interested in becoming something. I was enthralled with professional wrestling, and somebody told me, an old timer named George Bolus, the original Zebra Kid, get your education, which I did, and that the wrestling world would always be there. So I got my degree, and what was the question again? I got off on a tangent.
Oh, just about your thoughts of Vince. You said you thought he was a genius. McMahon.
Yes. So I worked for. I was in the living in Connecticut at the time, and so I ended up working for Vince McMahon, and I was part of the creative team along with Pat Patterson, and so Pat, Vince, and I spent an awful lot of time together, and really, Pat Patterson is the one person who I consider the most influential person, along with Eddie Graham, but who to me was really at the core of the success of the WWE. He's a guy who, as a performer, was a main eventer. He and Ray Stevens in California had a phenomenal run there, and then went to Minneapolis under Vern Gagne and continued that run. So I have a lot of respect for him, because here's somebody who, somebody can tell you something in theory, but it always means a lot more when that same person has a resume and a track record of having done everything that he's trying to school you in and to guide your career. And Pat was a main eventer, had an incredible mind for the business, great for working out finishes, and when all the WrestleMania main events, that's one thing that Vince had tremendous confidence in Pat. And once the main event were set, in order to make sure that premier event for the year was as successful as it could be, Pat would take the two headliners and basically devote a month to working with them privately in various isolated places where there weren't people around, to fine-tune their match. And when it came to the main event for WrestleMania every year, it was always a spectacular thing, because Pat had been involved.
Now, what's kind of the first thing that pops in your mind when I say Sting?
Sting came from the West Coast, where actually he and Lex Luger were partners out there, and then when they came east, Sting was somebody who had great talent. There have been people who've been successful in the professional wrestling business who weren't necessarily fans of the profession, and that's how I would when I think of Lex. He had everything. He had the physique, and he had certainly a great degree of success. But it wasn't something that, like for me as a kid, I first fell in love with wrestling when I was about 16 years old, and go all the way back, tracing my early years to when Argentina Rocco was selling out the Garden in New York every third week, and Chief Big Heart, and Haystacks Calhoun, Bobo Brazil. I mean, these were the stars that just, they were like the Mickey Mantle of baseball. That's what they were to professional wrestling, and people. I was always fortunate to be around people that had great talent and were pioneers in building what the world of professional wrestling is today. Huge success, and what makes it so unique is that it's a lot of things, like they say, like football is huge in North America. It has expanded some to Europe, but a lot of places in the world it doesn't have the same degree of popularity. But the one thing about professional wrestling is that it really is truly global. That you can go anywhere in the world, and I've had a chance to travel. I haven't been to South America, but been through most of North America. Spent a year in Australia, New Zealand. Made like close to 20 tours of Japan, and professional wrestling is something that has global popularity.
What about a guy like Black Bart? What do you think about when you think of Black Bart?
Black Bart was a guy who had a passion for the business as well, and he and Ron Bass were tag partners, and he was a guy who he was and I mean this in a positive way, not a demeaning way. He was a good old country boy, and he used to have his chaw tobacco, and he was a guy that went out there with a tremendous pride in what he was doing and gave his best effort. And he was a guy who there were other people that maybe had more more raw talent, but nobody had more passion for the business than he did. And I never had a reputation as somebody who played ribs, because I always felt that if you did ribs, then you had to expect there was going to be a payback somewhere along the way.
Oh, yeah.
And it was going to happen to you. And so I thought, I'm going to avoid that. I'm not going to be someone that gets caught in that cycle. But one day, Ron Bass, he and Ron Bass were partners, and they were long riders, and they had those long trench coats. And Bart spent really some really good money in a really, really expensive Stetson cowboy hat. And I remember, that meant so much to him. And I remember one night they used to bring the gear back from the ring, the trench coats and the hat. And like I said, I was never one for ribs or something, and I don't know what caused me to do it, but I wasn't with them that night, and they went to the ring, came back, and they used to take the ring gear and used to pile it on the chair right inside the dressing room door. And I looked, and there was the coat all basically wadded up, and there was this beautiful cowboy hat on top, and totally uncharacteristic of me. But there was nobody standing there watching me, and as I walked by, I took my hand and smashed the hat down, and just kept on. I laugh about it now, but I'm embarrassed to even share the story. But Ron Bass came back, and he always gave 100+% every night that he ever went to the ring, and had such pride in he wasn't somebody who was blessed with a lot of money, and he got the best that he could have, and that hat was his pride and joy. And he came back, and I was across the room and not looking directly, and he looked at that hat all squashed down. And if there was ever a moment that I think I would have seen a grown man cry, I think that was the moment. And I think it was, it was over 10 years for sure, and maybe even closer to 15 years later, that I finally one night, because he was somebody that I was around a lot and really liked personally, and he was just a good-hearted guy, and I had this guilt all this time because he nobody would own up to who did it. Certainly the guy that brought the ring gear back always treated everybody's gear with respect. He certainly never would have smashed the hat down, and that devastated Bart, and I carried that guilt around, and I think it was at least 10 years later, and I rode with him that night, and we were in the car, and he not that he was always real talkative, but he also wasn't real quiet. And he got into the car, and God, if it was an hour drive back to where we had met, or where we had lived, he for over 30 minutes, over more than that, just sat there staring ahead, never said a word. And finally he said, boy, he said, I've gone through all the names of everybody that was in the dressing room that night, all the guys that were there. And he said, trying to figure out which one of the guys would have done this. And I'm sitting next to him in the car, and I'm the culprit. And I just stared straight ahead, didn't smile, and he then says, I've gone through all the names of everybody that was there. And he said, and I started with you, and I knew that you would never do anything like that. Now, you talk about somebody that wants to sink down in the seat that felt like about an inch tall. That was me. And he couldn't. He went through all the names, and he said he just couldn't go through the process of elimination and come down to the one guy that he thought was the logical guy that would have done that. And so I kept that secret for I know it was well past 10 years, I know. And he had dinner one night with his family and invited me to come over with my wife at the time and had dinner. And in the middle of dinner, I said, my conscience is getting the best of me. And I said, I confessed to it. I said, I don't know what caused me to do it. I respected everybody else's gear because I wanted them to respect my gear. And I said, I can't give you a reason why I did it. But I said, I'm the one that squashed your hat. And just did it, walking by without thinking. And then it was already done. And I couldn't undo what I had done. And he looked at me. And, of course, 10 years later, it wasn't like he would have exploded that night if he found out who it was, and I probably would have had to fight him. But I don't remember what his reaction was, but it was almost like relief that 10 years later he finally had the answer as to who it was, and he had said himself that I was the last one that he ever thought would have ever done something like that, and which made me feel even smaller.
That's so great, though. You kept it a secret for that many years. That's great. I love that.
Yeah.
Keeping the rib alive. That's great.
Yeah, it was one of those things that I did. I didn't have malice. I had nothing against him. It just was, I can't explain why I did it. You walk by, you see something there, and boom, I squashed it and kept on going. And then he came, minutes later and just stared at it for the longest time. And it was something that was done that I couldn't undo. And then rode with him that night. And it was like someone who has lost somebody very dear in their family. He just was, the silence was deafening. And finally he said, I've gone through everybody that was there that night. And he said, no, JJ would never have done that. And of course, so it was 10 years or over 10 years after that. It was well past 10 years. And went to dinner one night and had a drink or two, and I said, I have a confession. And by that time, he didn't have the anger that he would have been that night. I'm sure that night.
Oh, yeah, of course, yep. Now, what about a guy like Buddy Landell?
Buddy Landell was somebody who a lot of people, what he was like a clone of Ric Flair. And actually, the idea with marketing him in the beginning was that he was like the other Nature Boy, only he was going to be a better Nature Boy than the Nature Boy Ric Flair. And I think initially I managed him, and he was a guy who was really, really a super, super nice guy, and a credit to the business. And he was somebody who, always had a dark cloud over him that if anything could go wrong to somebody, it'd end up that he would be the one. And I remember one example was there was a hotel, I think it was somewhere in New York, and it was a night that they had like some snow and sleet and some wet weather, and there was a hotel that had two. You would go and you'd had an automatic, like with electric eye, sliding door. Then you would go further, and then there was a second sliding door. But around the first one was susceptible to whatever the weather was that night. So it had rained, and the footing was slippery, and the feet went out from under him right in the doorway, and the door automatically closed because he was laying flat, so that the electric eye didn't pick him up, and the door hit him in the leg, and it banged him up pretty good. I mean, he was he was off for a while as a result. It just was a freak accident, and I felt sorry for him because he was a good guy, and some guys just, like I say, a dark cloud hangs over them and follows them around, and that was Buddy Landell.
Love it.